The aroma of cinnamon and burnt sugar usually filled Greg's bakery-cum apartment, a comforting scent that clung to everything, including, he was pretty sure, his dreams. But today, the air was thick with a different kind of tension, a nervous hum that vibrated through the very foundations of Greg's galactic goodies. He adjusted his slightly askew baker's hat, the one with the tiny embroidered planet circling it, and glanced at the clock. 2:57 p.m. 3 more minutes until his life took a turn for the, well, he wasn't sure what it was going to turn into. He'd received the official notice from the Earth-Alien Cohabitation Program 2 weeks ago, a formal document practically vibrating with officialdom. It stated, in no uncertain terms, that he, Gregory Gregor Miller, owner of a quirky, slightly cartoonish bakery, was being selected to host a member of the HFY species for an initial period of 6 months. He had, of course, initially thought it was some kind of elaborate prank, maybe a belated April Fool's joke. But then the earnest representative from the program had arrived at his doorstep, a woman with a clipboard and an expression that suggested she'd seen it all, including alien roommates, and was utterly unfazed. Now, here he was, nervously wiping down the already spotless counter for the 10th time, his heart doing a jittery salsa. He'd always been a man of routine, his life a carefully balanced recipe of early mornings, baking, and late-night sci-fi movie marathons. A tentacled alien was definitely not part of that recipe. The bell above the door jingled, pulling him from his anxious reverie. He straightened up, pasting a nervous smile on his face, and saw, well, not a monster, but definitely not a human either. Standing there, blinking with large, multifaceted eyes, was a HFY. Their skin was a mesmerizing shade of iridescent turquoise, shimmering softly as they moved. They were tall, taller even than him at 6 feet 2 inches, and slender, with 4 thin, tentacle-like appendages tipped with delicate manipulators. Small, almost decorative fins adorned their spine and arms. They looked both fragile and somehow incredibly powerful. Hi, Greg managed, his voice coming out a bit higher than usual. You must be Zyla? The HFY tilted their head, their large eyes taking in every detail of the bakery. Then, a series of rapid clicks and whistles emanated from their beak, followed by a flash of pink across their skin. Greg blinked. Okay. I'm gonna assume that was a greeting? Yes, a voice responded, slightly tinny and heavily synthesized, coming from a small translator device that hung around their neck. Greetings, Greg Miller. I am Zyla of Xylos. I apologize for the delay, customs procedures are complex. No problem, I get it. Paperwork is a nightmare, even on Earth, Greg chuckled, trying to ease the tension. He gestured around the small bakery, half shop, half apartment. Welcome to, well, my place. It's not much, but the rent is reasonable. He laughed nervously again, rubbing the back of his neck. So, you can set your stuff down anywhere, I guess? You got bags, or tentacle luggage? Zyla's skin shimmered a deeper shade of blue, and they gestured with one of their delicate manipulators at a small, levitating box that had followed them through the door. My belongings are contained within. I trust it is not an impediment. Oh, right. Levitation. Yeah, that's cool. I've seen it in movies, but it's way more impressive in real life. Greg, trying to stay cool, moved towards the door. All right, well, let's get you moved in. He suddenly paused, remembering a last-minute conversation with the rep from the program. Oh, right. Humidity. So, you need a humid environment, right? The rep mentioned something about it, like a swamp thing needs a swamp. Zyla tilted their head again, the clicking noises echoing in their throat. A humid environment is preferred, yes. My species requires a certain level of atmospheric moisture to maintain proper physiological function. Greg blinked. Physiological function. Right. Of course. Okay, no problem. So, how humid are we talking? Like rainforest? Tropical paradise? I have a small bathroom, I could maybe fill it with steam? I've seen it on TV. Xyla's skin pulsed with a light shade of violet, and their translator crackled as they responded. The preferred humidity level is approximately 75%, with a temperature of 18 degrees Celsius. I do not believe the bathroom facilities are suitable for continuous habitation. Greg swallowed, his brain suddenly feeling like it was trying to juggle several hot pastries at once. 75%? That's pretty humid, right? He scanned the room, suddenly very aware of how utterly dry his bakery was. I have a tiny humidifier, a travel-size one. It's really good for, like, dry airplane air. Xyla looked around the room, their gaze settling on a small, decorative succulent sitting forlornly on a high shelf. That appears to be suffering. Yeah, Barry the succulent is not having his best day, humidity-wise, Greg admitted, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. Okay, this might be a problem. He pulled out his phone and quickly started searching for industrial-sized humidifier Arizona. The search results came back with mostly pool supplies. Oh boy, he muttered to himself. Xyla shifted closer, and before Greg could even react, one of their tentacle-like appendages reached out and gently touched his arm. It was surprisingly soft, and Greg felt a strange tingle run through him, completely different from anything he'd ever experienced. You appear distressed, Xyla stated, the translator struggling with the nuance. Their skin pulsed a pale shade of green. Is there an issue? Greg jumped slightly, his heart doing a frantic tap dance against his ribs. No, I'm fine. Just trying to figure out the best way to make you, comfortable. He cleared his throat. Maybe there's a hardware store nearby. I could get a bigger one? Xyla's head tilted again, and they made a series of rapid clicks that the translator somehow managed to decipher as, your scent indicates heightened activity. Are you unwell? Greg's face flushed a furious red. Was he emitting some kind of weird, anxious sweat pheromone? He took a step back, trying to create some personal space, only to have Xyla take another step forward, one of their appendages reaching out again, this time towards his face. I'm fine, just, let's go get you that humidifier, okay? You're invading my personal bubble space a bit. He added the last part more to himself. He could have sworn that Xyla's skin pulsed a shade of what could be interpreted as a light blush. Bubble space, they repeated slowly, as if trying to figure out its meaning. An intriguing concept. Let us acquire the necessary equipment. Greg grabbed his keys, a small sense of purpose and maybe, just maybe, a smidge of excitement, starting to bubble up. He wasn't going to let a very large, humidity-loving, tentacled alien disrupt his life. He was a baker? He could handle anything. Even a tentacled roommate. Right, then. To the hardware store we go. As they stepped out onto the sun-baked street, Greg couldn't help but wonder, with a mixture of dread and a bizarre sense of anticipation, just how much more weirdness this was going to bring into his life. The hardware store was a symphony of clanking metal, the acrid scent of sawdust, and the occasional frustrated grunt of someone wrestling with a stubborn pipe. Greg, navigating the aisles with Xyla in tow, felt like he'd stepped into a bizarre, slightly steampunk version of E.T. Xyla. Their iridescent skin shimmering under the fluorescent lights, seemed fascinated by everything, their large, multifaceted eyes taking in every detail of the tools and gadgets surrounding them. So, the guy at the counter said this one should do the trick, Greg said, patting a box containing what looked like a small, portable fog machine. It's got, adjustable settings. We can crank it up to tropical rainforest if you want. He was trying to inject some levity into the situation, but the slightly panicked edge in his voice was hard to miss. Xyla tilted their head, a series of quiet clicks emanating from their throat. The specifications appear satisfactory. However, is the noise output tolerable? Oh, yeah, it's not too loud, Greg assured them, unless you set it to the thunderstorm mode, but I don't think we'll be using that anytime soon. He hauled the heavy box to the checkout and he noticed that Xyla was staring at a display of various types of screws and bolts with an intensity that suggested they were contemplating the meaning of the universe through tiny pieces of metal. You good? Greg asked, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Xylar's skin pulsed with a soft, lavender hue, and the translator crackled. The structural integrity of the human dwellings is perplexing. So many small, interlocking components. Greg chuckled, yeah, well, we're a bit of a DIY species. If something breaks, we kinda just figure it out as we go. He paid for the humidifier, feeling a mix of apprehension and a strange sort of camaraderie with his alien roommate. This was definitely not how he'd imagined his Tuesday afternoon. Back at the bakery, Greg set about unpacking the humidifier, while Xylar, after some deliberation, settled onto a small, slightly oversized beanbag chair near the back of the shop. He could hear the quiet clicks and whistles as they observed his movements. The aroma of freshly baked bread, which usually calmed his nerves, felt a little off with the added layer of the hum of the humidifier. The machine quickly pumped the air with moisture, and the bakery soon felt like a slightly humid greenhouse. Even Barry the succulent seemed to be perking up. So, how's that? Greg asked, wiping his brow with a flour-dusted hand. You feeling more physiologically functional? Xylar's skin shimmered, this time a deeper, more tranquil blue, and they responded, the atmospheric conditions are significantly improved. Thank you, Greg Miller. Your efforts are appreciated. They paused, then added, though the scent is intense. Greg frowned. Intense? You mean the bread? It's just a sourdough rye. Not unpleasant, Xylar clarified, but overwhelmingly yeasty. My olfactory senses are highly developed. Perhaps we could experiment. Experiment? Greg blinked, trying to decipher the nuance in their synthesized voice. Experiment? Who? Like baking experiments. You into baking? Xylar made a series of clicks and whistles. I am curious about the human concept of taste and flavor. It is said to be a multi-layered and diverse. Greg grinned, a genuine smile finally breaking through his nervous facade. Okay, now you're talking my language. How about this? We'll do a taste test. I'll make a few different things, and you can tell me what works and what doesn't. Sound good? Xylar's skin shimmered with a light green, which Greg was starting to interpret as a sign of either agreement or mild amusement. A culinary exploration. I find that acceptable. The next few hours turned into an unexpected baking bonanza. Greg, initially hesitant, found himself having a blast explaining the intricacies of different flours, sugars, and spices to Xylar, who watched him with rapt attention, their tentacle-like appendages occasionally reaching out to touch the ingredients with a delicate, almost reverent, gesture. Xylar's highly developed olfactory senses turned out to be a double-edged sword. They could distinguish the faintest hint of cinnamon from a mile away, which was impressive, but they also had a rather intense reaction to certain ingredients. The mere whiff of garlic, for instance, sent them into a fit of rapid clicks and flashing skin patterns that Greg interpreted as extreme displeasure. He had finally managed to find a couple of items that worked, a bland but sweet shortbread cookie and a sort of nut-based paste that he made on a whim, using something he called galactic walnuts. As the day wound down, and the scent of baked goods mingled with the hum of the humidifier, Greg found himself relaxing. Then, the bell above the door jingled, shattering the quiet harmony. A group of 3 local teenagers, their faces a mix of curiosity and open hostility, crowded into the shop. Is that the alien? One of them whispered loudly, pointing at Xylar. Greg, his smile fading, stepped in front of Xylar. Yeah, this is Xylar. They're my roommate. Any of you have a problem with that? He put his hands on his hips, trying to make himself look bigger. The teenagers exchanged glances. The tallest one, a boy with a perpetually scowling face, stepped forward. A roommate, huh? So you like sharing a room with it? That's weird, man. Real weird. Yeah, and what about our businesses? Another one chimed in, you think people want to buy food from a place where there's a thing living inside? Greg felt a surge of anger. Xylar's not a thing. They're just A different species. And what's it to you anyway? I've got all the permits and everything. My bakery is completely safe, and the ingredients are all top-notch. Xylar, who had been watching the interaction with a tilted head, made a series of rapid clicks, and their translator chimed in. Their olfactory output indicates hostility and mild fear. Is this a common occurrence among your species, Greg Miller? Greg wanted to laugh. He turned back to the teenagers. Look, just because Xylar is different doesn't make them a threat. They are actually kind of cool once you get to know them. The teens muttered amongst themselves. The scowling one, decided to be snide, pointed at Greg. You're weird, Miller, always have been. Now you're having sleepovers with space monsters? They left then, with laughter echoing behind them. Greg sighed and turned to look at Xylar, who was now staring intently at him, their skin pulsing with a shade of deep purple. They seem perplexed, Xylar observed, their voice a little more mechanical than usual. And the scent is different again. It's like overripe fruit with a touch of burnt sugar. Is this fear? Greg rubbed his temples. Yeah, I guess. A little. It's complicated. People don't always like what they don't understand. But it's okay, I can deal with it. He wasn't sure if he was trying to convince Xylar or himself. We just need to get them to understand we're not a threat, and that being different can be cool, right? Xylar's skin shifted to a soft, warm orange. Cool, they repeated, the translator making the word sound oddly alien. An intriguing concept. Perhaps we could explore this concept of cool? Greg looked at his alien roommate, their shimmering skin, and their surprisingly gentle eyes. He had a feeling that his life was about to get a lot more interesting, even if that interesting was laced with more than a touch of chaos. He just hoped that he had enough flour to get them through it all. He had a very strange feeling, like a low hum of static in his bones, that the next few days were going to be quite a ride. The scent of yeast wasn't the only new aroma in his bakery. There was a subtle, almost undetectable, pheromonal scent that was now mingling with the cinnamon and burnt sugar, and Greg felt, with a sudden lurch in his stomach, that things were about to get a lot more complicated. And for some reason, he was starting to find the idea very, very intriguing. The next few days were, well, let's just say they were an experience. Xylar's behavior had shifted, subtly at first, and then with the subtlety of a runaway train. Greg had initially chalked it up to the stress of adjusting to a new environment, but after a particularly awkward incident involving a tentacle and a bowl of rising dough, he started to suspect that something else was going on. Xylar, who had previously maintained a reserved, almost aloof demeanor, now seemed, well, clingy. They would follow Greg around the bakery, their iridescent skin shifting through a kaleidoscope of colors that seemed to correspond with their, often confusing, emotional state. The previously infrequent, almost accidental touches of their tentacles had become more frequent and, dare he say it, intentional. One particularly harrowing morning, Greg was trying to frost a batch of cupcakes when one of Xylar's tentacles reached out and gently, almost caressingly, stroked his arm. He nearly dropped the piping bag, splattering frosting across the counter and, unfortunately, across Xylar's iridescent skin. Whoa! Xylar! Careful there! Greg exclaimed, quickly grabbing a damp cloth. Sorry about that, didn't mean to, cupcake you. He started to wipe away the frosting, his hands moving awkwardly, his heart rate doing a pretty good impression of a hummingbird. Xylar tilted their head, and the translator relayed, the frosting adheres. Your touch is stimulating. Their skin pulsed with a soft, peachy hue. Greg froze, his hand hovering just above Xylar's skin. Stimulating? Like in a good way? Or in a I need to go sterilize myself kind of way? He muttered the last part to himself. Xylar made a series of rapid clicks, their translator struggling to keep up. The sensation is novel and pleasurable. One of their tentacles reached out again, this time tracing a slow, deliberate line along his cheek. Greg's face flushed a deep red. He took a step back, trying to create some space, but Zylar just moved closer, their large, multifaceted eyes fixed on his face. Okay, Zylar, I'm getting a little confused here. What's going on? Are you okay? My biological functions are operating within standard parameters, Greg Miller, Zylar responded. Though I confess, my impulses are proving perplexing. That's when Greg decided it was time to seek professional help. He called the Earth-Alien Cohabitation Program, and after a brief, slightly frantic explanation, they sent over a young, enthusiastic xenobiologist named Dr. Aries Thorne. Dr. Thorne arrived with a bag full of equipment and an expression that suggested this was the most exciting thing that had happened to her all week. So, what exactly is going on with our Zylar friend? Dr. Thorne asked, her eyes sparkling with scientific curiosity as she examined Zylar, who was currently watching Greg attempt to measure out sugar with a peculiar, almost laser-focused stare. Greg explained the recent change in Zylar's behavior, the increased physical contact, the strange color changes, and the general, overwhelming sense of what is happening here. Dr. Thorne listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration, before finally pulling out a small device that looked like a souped-up thermometer. Okay, let's see here. I think I have an idea what's happening. She aimed the device at Zylar, a low hum emanating from it as it took readings. Ah, yes, as I suspected. It appears that Zylar has entered their mating season. Greg blinked. Mating season? You mean, like, they're looking for a partner? Dr. Thorne nodded, her eyes widening with excitement. Yes, the Zylar mating season is a fascinating phenomenon. It involves a complex pheromonal exchange, along with certain behavioral changes. Their pheromones are designed to attract a compatible mate. It's quite a spectacle. She flipped through a tablet. It seems like this cycle happens every 3 Earth years. Lucky you. Greg felt his face go pale. So, you're saying that, all of this, he gestured wildly at Zylar, who was now attempting to braid his apron strings with their tentacle, is just hormones? Well, yes and no, Dr. Thorne said, it's not just hormones, but they play a significant part. Their pheromones can be quite potent. You, as a nearby non-Zylar, may be experiencing some of their effects. She wiggled her eyebrows. They can do a lot to, well, make you feel the desired dot. Greg's heart did a weird flutterkick in his chest. Desired? Oh God, he looked at Zylar, who was now nibbling at the corner of his apron, their skin a shade of bright, shimmering pink. So, what do I do? Do I just put on a sign saying not an eligible bachelor, please don't pheromone me? Dr. Thorne chuckled. Well, you could try, but pheromones are a bit hard to block. The best thing is to try to understand their signals. Zylar mating behavior is very complex. They express interest through a mix of physical contact, pheromonal cues, and of course, their unique clicking vocalizations. You'll have to learn their language, so to speak. She added, though I am sure that as a human, you have your own methods to express interest. It's an interesting case study for interspecies attraction. She scribbled on her tablet and looked up at Greg. I have a few brochures you can read for more information, as well as a number you can call if you need any more help, or, moral support. She winked at him. Greg felt a mix of panic and, strangely, a flutter of something that felt a lot like curiosity. This wasn't just awkward, it was a full-blown interspecies hormonal crisis, and he was right in the middle of it. He took the brochure from Dr. Thorne. It felt more like a death sentence than anything informative. Just then, the bell above the door jingled, and a tall, impeccably dressed man with a smug expression walked into the bakery. It was Mr. Sterling, the owner of Sterling Sweets, the high-end bakery across the street. He was Greg's nemesis, and seeing his smug grin made Greg's blood boil. Well, Miller, Sterling said, his voice dripping with condescension. I must say, your little bakery has become quite the spectacle. He cast a disdainful look at Zylar, who was now attempting to balance a measuring cup on their head with one tentacle. I hear you've taken to hiring unusual staff. He made air quotes. Greg glared at Sterling. What do you want, Sterling? Here to check up on my unusual staff? You know, maybe if you spent more time on your cakes instead of your spying, you'd actually sell something that isn't overpriced, stale, garbage? Sterling chuckled, a hollow, unpleasant sound. Oh, I'm sure your new staff is very stimulating, he said, making a pointed glance at Xylar, who was now emitting a series of rapid clicks and color changes that were clearly aimed directly at Sterling. But I'm here to make you a little business proposition, actually. Given that you're now distracted, I thought I might be doing you a favor by, let's say, purchasing your business. I'm sure that with the negative press you are getting in town, your future is rather bleak. Greg's hands curled into fists. My business is not for sale, Sterling. And for your information, Xylar is helping me out and they are, actually, quite good at taste testing, if you know what I mean. Unlike you. Sterling's face turned a shade of purple. You think that alien is going to save your sorry excuse for a bakery? I'll give you a week, Miller. Then I'll buy you out and you can go back to flipping burgers at that dive diner down the street. He turned on his heel, a triumphant smirk on his face, and walked out of the bakery, leaving a trail of expensive cologne and bad intentions in his wake. Greg sighed, feeling completely overwhelmed. He had an alien roommate in the throes of mating season, a rival bakery owner trying to steal his business, and his own confused feelings bubbling just beneath the surface. He looked at Xylar, who was now staring at him with an intensity that made his toes curl. He had a very, very bad feeling that his life was about to get a whole lot more complicated. He suddenly felt the urge to grab one of his strongest espresso shots and lock himself in the storage room, but he knew that wasn't going to solve his problem. He was in a phenomenal panic, and he had no idea how to get out of it. Greg stared at his reflection in the slightly smudged glass of the bakery's front door. His hair was a mess, his eyes were bloodshot, and he had a faint dusting of flour on his cheek that he hadn't even noticed. He looked like he'd been dragged through a hedge backwards, which, in a way, he had. The past few days had been a whirlwind of confusing pheromones, awkward encounters, and the constant, looming threat of Mr. Sterling and his predatory business tactics. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. Okay, Miller, think, he muttered to himself, grabbing a stray pastry from the display case and absent-mindedly chewing on it. What do you do when you're backed into a corner? You bake. That's when it hit him. He wouldn't just bake, he'd bake his way out of this mess. He'd show the town, and especially Sterling, that his bakery wasn't just a place with a weird alien roommate, it was a place where magic happened. He would organize an interstellar bake-off, a celebration of human and Xylar culinary collaboration, and he'd do it right here, in his slightly humid, perpetually yeasty, bakery. He turned around to find Xylar standing behind him, their skin pulsing with a soft, amber hue. Greg Miller, the translator clicked, your scent indicates heightened activity. And a touch of desperation. Is there a pressing matter? Actually, yes, Greg said, a grin starting to spread across his face. I have an idea. I'm gonna host a baking competition. A big one. And we're going to do it together. We're gonna make the best, weirdest, most delicious alien-inspired treats this town has ever seen. Xylar tilted their head. A competition? This concept of competing is intriguing. Is it a test of skill? Or a ritualistic display of dominance? Greg chuckled, it's a little bit of both, I guess. But mostly, it's a way for people to come together and eat delicious things. And also, it's a way for me to prove to Sterling that I'm not going down without a fight. Xylar's skin shimmered with a bright, almost excited green. I find this acceptable. Shall we commence with the preparations? And so, the planning began. Greg spent the rest of the day drafting flyers, making calls to local news outlets, and brainstorming ideas for bizarre, otherworldly recipes. He and Xylar worked in tandem, a strange but surprisingly effective team. Greg, with his years of baking experience and penchant for improvisational cooking, and Xylar, with their highly refined sensory perception and a surprisingly insightful understanding of flavor profiles, were a force to be reckoned with. they decided on a menu that combined the best of both worlds: Greg sourdough with a HFY-inspired Stardust swirl, a human-style fruit tart infused with the aromatic glowberries Zyla had brought with them, and a savory nebula nut bread that used a combination of earthly nuts and an assortment of alien ingredients. The day of the bake-off dawned bright and sunny, and the street outside Greg's bakery was buzzing with activity. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the promise of unique treats and the chance to get a glimpse of the infamous alien roommate. Greg, feeling a mix of nerves and adrenaline, adjusted his baker's hat and took a deep breath. He was ready. The competition started with a flurry of activity. Bakers, both amateur and professional, buzzed around their stations, kneading dough, whipping cream, and creating edible masterpieces. But it was Greg and Zyla who stole the show. They moved in perfect synchronicity, their movements a strange, almost choreographed dance of human ingenuity and alien precision. Zyla's tentacles moved with surprising dexterity, delicately arranging fruit, mixing ingredients, and adding small, almost imperceptible touches that elevated their dishes to a whole new level. As the competition wore on, Greg found himself growing closer to Zyla. They communicated in a mixture of broken English, hand gestures, and the occasional series of rapid clicks and whistles, their understanding of each other growing with each passing minute. He learned how to interpret the subtle shifts in Zyla's skin color, the soft pink indicating amusement, the warm orange a sign of contentment, the deep blue a sign of focus. Then, it was time for the main event, the tasting. The judges, a mix of local food critics and prominent community members, took their seats, their faces a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. One by one, the bakers presented their creations, their efforts met with polite applause. But when it came to Greg and Zyla, the room fell silent. Greg presented their Stardust swirl sourdough, explaining the subtle, almost otherworldly flavor notes. Zyla presented the glowberry tart, their skin pulsing with a soft, inviting glow as they described the unique properties of the alien fruit. Finally, they presented their nebula nut bread, a savory loaf that had a complex, almost ethereal aroma that filled the room. The judges tasted the dishes, their expressions ranging from surprised to delighted to utterly speechless. They were, in a word, captivated. Then, as Greg watched the judges evaluate their final dish, he saw Zyla staring at him, their skin pulsing with a shade that he had never seen before, a deep, almost luminous violet. He heard the translator, Greg Miller, "Your dedication is captivating." He turned to find that Zyla was now holding a small, almost perfectly formed, cake. The cake had the same swirl pattern as their sourdough, with a small, bright, edible star placed on top. As Greg looked closer, he realized that the swirl was not just a design, it was emitting a soft, pheromonal scent that was almost intoxicating. He felt a strange tug in his chest as he saw that one of the judges was suddenly tearing up. This is incredible. This bread, it makes me feel like I'm home, like I've always been searching for this taste, this comfort." The next judge suddenly turned to their neighbor. I think I'm in love. Is that even possible?" Greg turned to Zyla. "What did you do?" He whispered, "What did you put in that cake?" Zyla pulsed a light green and turned to the crowd. "This is a traditional XY love bond cake. It expresses feelings through specific pheromonal components. It is meant for the one it is gifted to." The room was silent as everyone realized what that meant. Greg felt his face flush a deep red, and his heart started doing a strange sort of samba in his chest. He was pretty sure that half of the people in the crowd were now openly sobbing. He looked at Zyla, who was now watching him, their eyes locked with his, a sense of unspoken understanding passing between them. Sterling looked like he was about to have a stroke. He had been standing in the back, smirking, convinced of his victory, now looked ashen. He tried to argue, but all that came out of his mouth was a series of incoherent spluttering. The judging concluded, and it was no surprise when Greg and Zyla were declared the winners. The crowd erupted in applause, and even some of the teenagers who had previously sneered at Zyla were now looking at them with a mixture of awe and respect. Greg and Zyla stood side by side, basking in the glow of their victory. As he looked at Zyla, he realized that this wasn't just a business win, it was a personal one. He was starting to understand the nuances of their unique communication, and for the first time, he felt like he was truly seeing Xylar, not just as an alien roommate, but as someone he was developing a deep connection with. And as he caught the sweet, pheromonal scent of the Bond cake, he realized that those feelings might be more complicated than he was ready to admit. He now not only had a tentacled roommate, but a tentacled roommate who was broadcasting his feelings with a pheromonal cake. He might not be sure what the future held, but he was sure of one thing: he and Xylar were definitely not just roommates. The aftermath of the bake-off was a whirlwind of media attention, local celebrations, and a general sense of bewildered awe. Greg's Bakery had become the talk of the town, and Greg's Galactic Goodies was now a household name, synonymous with delicious, otherworldly treats and, of course, the enigmatic alien roommate. But behind the bright lights and the cheering crowds, there was a simmering tension that Greg couldn't ignore. The Bond cake, with its potent pheromonal message, had thrown a wrench into his carefully constructed world. He was no longer just a baker with an alien roommate, he was a baker with an alien roommate who had, quite literally, declared their affections through a baked good. He found himself constantly stealing glances at Xylar, trying to decipher the complex language of their shifting skin colors and clicking vocalizations. He also found himself wondering, quite frequently, what exactly a HFY mating ritual looked like, and if he was even remotely prepared for it. One evening, after closing up the bakery, Greg decided it was time to address the elephant, or rather, the tentacled HFY in the room. He found Xylar in their usual spot on the beanbag chair, their skin pulsing with a slow, rhythmic pattern of blues and greens. "Hey, Xylar," Greg said, trying to keep his voice casual, "we need to talk." He sat down on the floor, a little too close to Xylar for comfort, but he wasn't sure how to navigate this particular conversation, so he just plunged in, "About the cake, you know, the Bond cake." Xylar tilted their head, a series of rapid clicks emanating from their throat. "The cake is a traditional expression of affinity. The pheromones within were designed to convey a specific message. Did the message not reach its intended recipient?" Greg swallowed, his face flushing a shade of red he hadn't thought possible. "Oh, it reached me, all right. Loud and clear. The entire town knows about it. And it was quite clear, especially as all the judges were openly sobbing by the end of it. But I'm not sure if I completely understand what you meant by it. I'm still not an expert on HFY culture, even if I can now pronounce xylophone perfectly." Xylar moved closer, one of their tentacles reaching out to gently touch his arm. "My feelings towards you, Greg Miller, are complex. Your scent is pleasing. Your presence is stimulating. Your actions are admirable. I find your human concept of loves to be intriguing." Greg's heart did a little somersault in his chest. Okay, intriguing is one way to put it. But I don't know what to do with that. We're from completely different planets. We eat different food, we breathe different air. Your mating season is like a hormonal earthquake, and sometimes I feel like I'm living in an alien petting zoo. How are we supposed to, be? Xylar's skin shifted to a shade of deep violet, and the translator relayed, "Your concerns are valid. The biological and cultural differences are significant." But they paused, and their voice, even through the translator, sounded softer, more intimate. "But the connections I have formed with you are unique. The pheromones are a part of me, but my intent goes far beyond a simple biological imperative." Greg felt a warmth spread through him, a feeling that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. "So, it's not just hormones? You actually like me?" He hated the vulnerable tremble in his voice. Xylar's skin pulsed a soft, almost shy, pink. "I am fascinated by you, Greg Miller. I find you to be remarkable. And yes, my feelings for you are genuine. I believe that the word you humans use is love . Greg stared at Xylar, his mind reeling. He had never expected to find himself in this situation. He was a baker, not an intergalactic heartthrob. But here he was, sitting on the floor of his bakery, having a heart-to-heart conversation with a tentacled alien who had just confessed to having feelings for him. He couldn't lie, he was starting to like the idea, as terrifying as it might be. But he was still hesitant. He didn't want to break Xylar's heart, and he wasn't sure if he could fully commit to something so different. He took a deep breath. Okay, Xylar, I'm not going to lie, this is a lot. And I'm still trying to figure it out, but I like you too. I really do. You're interesting, and funny, and surprisingly good at baking. And even if your tentacles make me jump sometimes, they are quite soft, and I admit that they do make me feel, well, stimulated as you said. He blushed furiously as he said that, but I'm also terrified. We are so different. And I don't know if I can. Before Greg could finish, Xylar reached out, their tentacle gently cupping his face. They made a series of soft clicks, and their skin pulsed a warm, golden hue, a color that Greg had come to associate with comfort and affection. There is no need for fear, Greg Miller, the translator relayed, the voice sounding even softer now. We will navigate this together. Our differences are merely a challenge to be overcome. We will find a way. They tilted their head, and one of their manipulators gently traced a line across his cheekbone. And if the way includes occasional stimulating encounters, then I find that perfectly acceptable. Greg felt a strange wave of calm wash over him. He reached out, his hand covering Xylar's tentacle, his fingers intertwining with their delicate manipulators. It was a strange, yet strangely intimate touch, a meeting of two worlds that felt both alien and incredibly familiar. Okay, Greg whispered, his voice barely audible. Okay. I think I can do this. We can figure this out. Together. Just as Greg was about to lean in, wanting, more than anything, to understand Xylar's unique phenomenal language, the bakery door suddenly burst open. It was Dr. Aries Thorne, the xenobiologist, her face flushed, her eyes wide with excitement. Greg! Xylar! I have news. The HFY mating season, it's intensifying. Their pheromone output is off the charts. I'm getting readings that are practically unheard of. It's going to be intense. You might want to get a handle on it. She took a deep breath. Oh, sorry, was I interrupting something? Greg and Xylar both pulled back, their skin shifting to a mixture of embarrassed pinks and blues. No interruption, just having a chat, Greg said, clearing his throat. Just talking about, baking. Yes, baking. We were about to start some new experiments, right, Xylar? He gave a nervous laugh that sounded more like a strangled hiccup. Xylar's skin pulsed a shade of deep red, and the translator relayed, affirmative. We were commencing a culinary collaboration. Dr. Thorne raised an eyebrow, a mischievous glint in her eyes. Right. Well, just be aware, the next few days might be, well, interesting. And maybe invest in some strong air fresheners. Their pheromones are going to be everywhere. She gave them a knowing look, and then she left as quickly as she came, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Greg and Xylar stared at each other, a mix of amusement and apprehension on their faces. They knew they had a long, complicated, and possibly very pheromone-filled road ahead of them. But for the first time, they were facing it together. And as Greg looked at Xylar's gentle eyes and soft skin, he knew that, no matter how strange or terrifying it might be, he wouldn't want to navigate it with anyone else. He took Xylar's tentacle in his hand again, and, taking a deep breath, leaned in, wanting, more than anything, to learn the language that only they could speak. He just hoped his bakery could survive the next few days, as it was sure to be a rollercoaster of pheromones, confusion, and maybe, just maybe, a touch of interspecies love. He knew, with a sinking heart, that stimulating was about to take on a whole new meaning. The days that followed were intense. Dr. Thorne hadn't been kidding about the pheromones. They were everywhere. The bakery, which had once smelled of cinnamon and yeast, now had a subtle, almost intoxicating aroma that made people either inexplicably happy or deeply emotional, sometimes both at the same time. Greg had become adept at recognizing the various signals Xylar was sending, the subtle shifts in their skin color, the rapid clicks, and the often confusing tactile expressions. He was, to put it mildly, fluent in Xylar flirtation. One particularly memorable morning, he was trying to prepare a new batch of cosmic croissants when Xylar approached him, their skin a shade of deep, shimmering turquoise, a color that Greg had learned meant intense affection. They made a series of soft, almost purring clicks and then, without warning, wrapped all four of their tentacles around his waist, pulling him into a surprisingly strong embrace. "Whoa! Xylar! Easy there, buddy," Greg chuckled, trying not to spill the bowl of melted butter he was holding. "A little warning next time, who? I almost dropped the good stuff." Xylar tightened their grip, their translator relaying, "Your scent is overwhelming. And comforting. I find myself drawn to your presence." They then proceeded to nuzzle their head against his chest, their small beak brushing against his shirt. Greg blushed, feeling a mix of amusement and a strange surge of affection. Okay, I get it. I'm irresistible. But, could you maybe let go for a sec? I have a bakery to run, and the croissants aren't gonna bake themselves." He gently unwrapped himself from Xylar's embrace, feeling a pang of disappointment as he did so. He was starting to really enjoy those tentacle hugs, which was a sentence he never thought he'd say. As the days went by, the town began to accept Greg and Xylar's relationship. The initial fear and curiosity had given way to a sort of bewildered acceptance, and people started to see them not just as a human and an alien, but as two individuals who were genuinely fond of each other. The teenagers who had previously sneered at Xylar were now regular customers, drawn in by the promise of the unique, alien-inspired treats and, perhaps, by a touch of curiosity. Even Mr. Sterling, the owner of Sterling Sweets, had changed his tune, though not entirely for altruistic reasons. He had come back to Greg's bakery, his tail between his legs, and offered a half-hearted apology. "Look, Miller, I'm sorry for how I behaved. But, I can't deny you've, well, become something of a local phenomenon. So, maybe we could do business together?" He added as an afterthought, "I'm told your alien has a great understanding of flavors. Maybe we could, collaborate?" Greg raised an eyebrow, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Collaborate, huh? After all the awful things you've said and done? After you tried to steal my business? I think I'd rather chew on a shoe." Sterling squirmed, his face turning a shade of red. Okay, point taken. But hear me out, Miller. We could make a killing with this. Think of the press. The publicity. Sterling Sweets and Galactic Goodies, a partnership for the ages. It practically writes itself. Greg chuckled, shaking his head. "No, thanks, Sterling. I think I'll stick to doing things my way. But if you want to try some of the cosmic croissants, I might be persuaded to sell you some. They do tend to sell out pretty quick." He added, his eyes twinkling, "especially if you promise to tell everyone how amazing they are." Sterling's face broke into a wide, relieved grin. "Deal, Miller. Deal. Just, no more the Bond cakes, okay? My emotions have been through enough." As their relationship grew, Greg began to incorporate more Xylar elements into their lives, not just in their baking but in their day-to-day interactions. He learned to read Xylar's tactile language, their soft touches, and gentle nudges, each one conveying a different shade of affection. He even started trying to mimic some of the Xylar vocalizations, much to Xylar's amusement. One evening, Greg decided to introduce Xylar to a very human concept: romantic gestures. He'd spent the afternoon decorating the bakery, putting up fairy lights, scattering rose petals, and setting up a small table for two with a candle and a bottle of non-alcoholic, sparkling cider. He led Xylar into the bakery, their skin pulsing with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "So," Greg said, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement, "in my culture, humans sometimes do things like this when they want to express affection. It's called a romantic dinner." Xylar